Hello, everyone, and welcome to a special live reading and commentary of the editorial written by Matt Lauer regarding Ronan Farrow. And who are these two people and why do they matter? Well, we'll discuss that as we go. Hello, chat. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Wednesday as I come to you live from my Corona bunker on the moon. I don't know why I just did that, but it felt appropriate. With Dog, Cat, Fox, and a Pepperjack, just cause why not? Rest assured, those of you who might have been showing up expecting some kind of TEDx talk or something, I swear I've got about 2 or 3 in the queue for a selection at some point this week. But I thought I'd take a break from that today, do something a little bit different. Because this was posted yesterday or the day before. Yeah, yesterday. And read a little bit last night on Lords of the Night, and it struck my fancy to the point where I thought, I'd like to look at this in a bit more in-depth. So here we are. But before I get into that, say hello to some of you who have decided to join me on this beautiful afternoon on the moon. Raziel, hello. Cultist4, hello. Zach Osborne, hello. Humble Clay, hello. Quinn the Cultist, hello. Purple Pill Perspective, hello. Mike R, hello. Becca Fairley, hello. M, hello. Check Your Logic, hello. John Miller, hello. Texas Red, hello. I do like my redheads. Graph Spree, hello. Gulkato, hello. The moon, you ask? Yes, the moon. I live on the moon, in my moon base, with my dog, cat, fox. Can't you see the background? I'm on the moon. So, there you go. John Smith, hello. And Hubble Clay's restarting Firefox. Oh, okay. Well, anyway, so let us begin. Now, for those of you who are unaware, a Viror of Ashmedai, hello. Am I hiding from the COVID? Oh, I'm totally hiding from the COVID. Can't survive here on the moon, so far as we know. So Matt Lauer and Ronan Farrow. Who are these two people? Well, Matt Lauer was a host of Good Morning America, wasn't it? No, the Today Show. Sorry. This is how much I pay attention to morning TV. Anyway, he was the host on the Today Show for like 25 some odd years. Him and Katie Couric and all that stuff. Ronan Farrow is the son, if I'm remembering correctly, of Mia Farrow, ex-wife of that guy who does all the movies. And suddenly I can't remember his name because, who cares, right? Woody Allen. That's what I meant. Ronan Farrow is a journalist of some repute. He is best known, at this point at least, for being the one to break the Harvey Weinstein scandal wide open and basically usher in the Me Too movement, the Believe All Women movement, and on and on and on. So he's somewhat of a celebrated figure. However, Matt Lauer contends, and apparently the New York Times corroborates to some extent, that Ronan Farrow's celebrity may in fact be a bridge too far based on his tactics and methods. But that's what we'll go into here. Thank you, the gayest person on YouTube, Dog, Cat, Fox. That says, what is he writing? Number 1. I'm number 1. Or maybe Dog, Cat, Fox has to go tinkle. I don't know. It does happen. Atheist Icon, hello. Kieverdam, hello. Fernanda, hello. Dark Alile, hello. All right. So now, the reason that this caught my attention, if you're watching Lords of the Night last night, but, and again, if this is repetitive to a certain extent as we go into this, I apologize, but I really want to take this from the top. As a co-host on Lords of the Night, I literally read the news of some form every night from CNN and other outlets from time to time. And over the last 2-3 years of doing this, if you have joined me and Monkey and Satsu at any point, you have noticed our critiques as we have seen the evolution of certain stories or the behavior of certain journalists, quote unquote, and etc. as the industry has rolled on through the Trump administration. So the quality and, let's say, integrity of journalism is something that I'm very interested in. I'm not a journalist, but I still have this sort of romanticized notion of a good journalist. You know, All the President's Men, Edward R. Murrow, William R. Murrow, no, Edward R. Murrow. The old school, like getting the story, getting it right, getting the facts. And I understand it's an idealistic standard to believe in these days, but it wasn't always the case. And so when things like this come up, I'm always curious. All right, well, that's enough preamble. So let us roll into this. Now, hopefully you all can see this. I don't have to do a sound check for once. That's interesting. Matt Lauer, why Ronan Farrow is indeed too good to be true. Posted May 19th, which is just yesterday. Thank you, tall person. Hoy all. I can't watch right now because reasons. I will watch in full later. Happy Flower Day, everybody. Well, thank you, tall person. Let me get my first sip of my pepper jack in. Wow, I think I mixed in a bit more jack than pepper in that one. But either way, moving on. Editor's note. After Matt Lauer submitted this piece, a response to Ronan Farrow's book, Catch and Kill, Mediaite editors independently fact-checked the accounts of the 4 witnesses/subjects Lauer spoke with and cites in this piece. All confirmed in early February that Lauer's account of their conversations was accurate. As with all Mediaite opinion pieces, the views expressed in this article are those of the author. Now, you see, that I don't believe I read that last night, but that little bit right there, that makes me feel all warm and fuzzy inside. Because what did these guys do? Even though it's an opinion piece, even though they have every right to just lean back on, this is the opinion of the author, they did their due diligence. I'm very glad of that. Now, individual actions do not necessarily tell a whole picture of either an industry or an individual, etc. So I take all these things on face value as they are, but in this one, I appreciate that. Moving on. A note of context. I had originally intended to release this piece in November of 2019, but personal considerations at that time, and later news events impacting us all, delayed those plans. This week, the New York Times published a piece that was highly critical of Ronan Farrow's journalistic methods and standards. Ronan stood by his reporting in response. The Times story prompted me to move forward with my own findings. In late November 2017, I was fired from my job at the Today Show after admitting to having a consensual yet inappropriate relationship with a fellow employee in the workplace. NBC said that was a violation of company policy, and it ended my 25-year career at the network. I say these words with sincerity and humility. I am sorry for the way I conducted myself. I made some terrible decisions, and I betrayed the trust of many people. Excuse me. If this story had ended there, you would not be reading this, but it did not end there. On October 9th, 2019, I was falsely accused of rape. The allegation came from Brooke Nevels, the same woman whose complaint resulted in my termination at NBC. It was made public as part of the promotional rollout for a new book by Ronan Farrow. This accusation was one of the worst and most consequential things to ever happen in my life. It was devastating for my family, and outrageously, it was used to sell books. Now, quick critique. The most consequential thing that ever happened in my life, I believe, and other experts can correct me, there should be a semicolon there, not a comma. But that might just be me. Continuing, at no time did Brooke Nevels ever use the words assault or rape in regards to any accusation against me while filing her complaint with NBC in November of 2017. That has been confirmed publicly. NBC never suggested I was being accused of such an offense when I met with their attorney on November 28th of that same year. They have also confirmed that publicly. I was shaken, but not surprised, that few in the media were willing to thoroughly challenge the accusations against me or the person making them. The rush to judgment was swift. In fact, on the morning I was falsely accused of rape, and before I could even issue a statement, some journalists were already calling my accuser brave and courageous. While the presumption of innocence is only guaranteed in a court of law, I felt journalists should have, at the very least, recognized and considered it. Now, a bit of an aside. I don't understand why Matt Lauer would think that to be the case. That's not to say that what was alleged against him was right or was handled correctly. But as someone who was involved in a kind of journalism, broadcast news, etc., and who had at that point witnessed what had happened to many celebrities, many notable people from the time of the Harvey Weinstein scandal and onward, Brett Kavanaugh, etc., that the innocent until proven guilty does not apply in the media when it comes to high-profile figures, and most especially if they happen to be on one particular side or associated with one particular side of the political spectrum. So that part really boggles me. Now, I forgot to, and I should have, but I didn't, look up what Matt Lauer's comments were regarding Brett Kavanaugh at the time that Brett Kavanaugh was being excoriated in the press for an accusation that had almost no evidence whatsoever. In fact, I don't think there was any evidence except for the word of the person. Yeah, at that point in time, I don't understand why he would think that to be the case. Moving on, I was also disappointed, but not surprised, that Ronan Farrow's overall reporting faced so little scrutiny. Okay, so you weren't surprised by the lack of scrutiny of the reporting, but you didn't understand that journalists weren't going to give you the benefit of the doubt. Okay. Until this week's critical reporting by the New York Times, many in the media perceived his work as inherently beyond basic questioning. However, he was hardly an unbiased journalist when it came to anything to do with NBC, and he was rarely challenged as he dropped salacious stories in a daily marketing effort designed to create media attention for his book. What I found when I read the book was frankly shocking, and it should concern anyone who cares about journalism. Well, Matt, I'm one of those people. This is not just about accusations against the former host of the Today Show. It's about whether changing social attitudes can be allowed to change the most fundamental rules of journalism. That is a very fair question. It's about whether, as journalists, we have a responsibility to check facts and vet sources. Well, see, here's the thing. I thought checking facts and vetting sources, and this isn't a criticism of Lauer on this point, I'm just saying that checking facts and vetting sources is what separates someone from being just a rumor monger and being a journalist in the first place. It's about understanding the difference between journalism and activism. Yes. It is about whether we are putting far too much trust in journalists whose publicly stated opinions impact their ability to remain objective. Yes, I agree, as we have talked about on many a time on Lords of the Night. But as an aside, I'm going to go over to the chat real quick, see what people have to say. Humble Clay says, I just now realized what a pepper jack is that he always refers to, Dr. Pepper and Jack Daniels. Welcome to the club, Humble Clay. Welcome to the club. You understand. I'm glad. Let's see. Is it Gilcato? Surprised equals stirred? Maybe. Zach Osborne, how dare you not give me the consideration I never gave to anyone else? Well, okay, and again, I don't know what Matt Lauer's pattern of attitude, comments, reporting, or whatever else was on people like Louis C.K. or Brett Kavanaugh and so on. People who were falsely accused of things, or at least thinly accused of things. So I don't know how much of a hypocrite Matt Lauer is on that point. I'd be curious to find out. I didn't do any due diligence before reading this because I'm not a journalist. I'm just a civilian. That one servant of Satania, hello, Scribelite, you're generous. Words of the person were also inconsistent. Well, that might be the case. And Soraya, hello, Scribe. Hello, Soraya. Mike Savage, Blarg. All right, moving on. Ronan Farrow. It is a fact that Ronan Farrow had negative feelings about NBC when he parted ways with the network in 2017. His history with NBC Comcast is a matter of public record. he had his show on MSNBC canceled. I'm really curious to know what... I never heard of the Ronan Farrow show, so I don't know what he did or what it was. And he openly claimed that the network spiked his reporting on the Harvey Weinstein scandal. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that might actually be the case. So, but anyway, he spoke about his dissatisfaction publicly. It would be hard for anyone to argue that when Ronan set out to write his book, he was even close to objective or unbiased when it came to NBC. Okay? I am not suggesting that everything Ronan has written in his book is untrue or based on misinformation. But it is clear that over the course of nearly 2 years, he became a magnet and a willing ear for anyone with negative stories about the network and people who worked for it. Consequently, he cultivated many sources who were also disgruntled or who had been fired by NBC and therefore had an incentive to come up with explanations for why their careers there didn't work out. I believe Ronan knew his work on Catch and Kill would receive little in the way of scrutiny from the very beginning. Well, I mean, he might have been arrogant enough to believe that and may have turned out to be correct, but it wasn't necessarily so. I mean, maybe some journalists should have vetted it or something. It's the only way to explain why he was so willing to abandon common sense and true fact-checking in favor of salacious and deeply flawed material. I believe there should be a hyphen between fact and checking, because I'm an English major and a nitpicker. I also believe that some of Ronan's sources felt they could make outrageous claims to him, knowing he, and thus their stories, would not be doubted. I mean, yeah, he could easily roll the dice in this particular era, in this particular instance, etc. You're right. People go for the headline and the salaciousness and don't look too hard at it. If the Trump era has taught us nothing else, merely making an accusation large enough to seem true is enough to make it true in today's media. I can't count how many times, and like I've said before, I don't take any particular joy in coming to Donald Trump's defense, but if you're going to hold him to account for something, hold him to account for things he says and things he does. Don't extrapolate meaning from something he said offhandedly or that you decided to take a certain way and then turn that into a story of fact, because that's been taking place since day one, and it is very frustrating. I'm sure he also understood that some people he referenced even indirectly in his book, who might completely contradict his version of events, would be too intimidated to step forward and correct the record. Ronan knows, as well as anyone, that there is a great deal of fear surrounding this subject, and it would take an act of selfless bravery, some might say foolishness, for anyone to challenge him or the story of an alleged victim of sexual assault. That's right. Because in the Me Too era, woe be to you, especially if you're a man who tries to correct the record after an accusation or tries to come to the defense of someone who's already been convicted in the media. You will be painted with the same brush. And it's true. Just as I was immediately labeled a victim blamer when I released a statement defending myself on October 9th, 2019, others would fear the same treatment. There should be another comma there after 2019, Matt. Others would fear the same treatment if they publicly disagreed with Ronan's reporting. Look at the criticism Times writer Ben Smith has received for his story. I believe Ronan was counting on their silence. Okay, I mean, again, maybe Ronan Farrow was arrogant enough to believe all that to be true, but you're edging towards attributing to Ronan Farrow certain godly powers of omniscience that I don't think he deserves. But anyway, moving on. There are 4 primary ways in which Ronan betrayed the truth in writing his book. Number 1, he consistently failed to confirm stories told to him by his main sources. Okay, well, if true, yeah, that is kind of not being a journalist. Number 2, he failed to provide evidence of important communications he alleges took place between accusers and me. In most cases, Ronan doesn't even claim to have personally seen evidence of those communications. So, rumor monger. Number 3, he used misleading language to manipulate readers into believing things that could easily be false or were at least unprovable. In some cases, he undeniably withheld information from the reader that would call the credibility of sources into question. Number 4, he routinely presented stories in a way that would suit his activist goals as opposed to any kind of journalistic standards. Yes, I have no doubt that Ronan Farrow's book was aimed to kill, so to speak. It was a targeted book hit piece on a whole bunch of things. Some of it true, some of it elaborated. The problem is, if you start accusing people of the most heinous of crimes, you better have the facts to back it up. Otherwise, you get into a whole different territory of legal entanglement. Even if the press gives you a pass, the courts might not. So I assume, and maybe we'll hear this later on in the story, that Matt Lauer is or has been pursuing legal action. In the following examples, I deliberately avoid challenging accusations which only result in questions of he said, she said. It is impossible to settle those questions in this format. Right. It's something that I've said. I mean, well, I should say it's in the spirit of something I've said about many of the videos that I've done in the past. Argue the point and not the person. All right. You can't really argue the accusation because, yeah, like I say, it's he said, she said. So what is the core of the issue? And then, examine that. What I am sharing here tightly fits the pattern of journalistic lapses laid out in reporting on Farrow by the New York Times. Quote, at times he does not always follow the typical journalistic imperatives of corroboration and rigorous disclosure, or he suggests conspiracies that are tantalizing but he cannot prove, unquote, Times writer Ben Smith wrote of Farrow in his piece on Monday, May 18th. He does not always follow the typical journalistic imperatives. That would kind of not make him a journalist, would it? Either it's an imperative to be a journalist or it isn't an imperative to be a journalist to follow those rules. So, yeah. Shortly before Ronan's book was released, Hachette, the company that published it, wrote this as part of a statement. Quote, the explosive and important new reporting in Catch and Kill has been meticulously vetted and fact-checked. We are proud to be publishing this book. Unquote. Just days before the book was released, Ronan gave an interview to George Stephanopoulos at ABC News. Stephanopoulos asked, quote, if Lauer or his allies say you didn't fact-check those claims, unquote. Quote, extensively fact-checked, as with everything in this book, unquote, Farrow replied. See if you agree with those statements as you read on. All right, so now we're getting into the nitty-gritty. So before we get there, check back with chat real quick. Some emulation says, a list? I love lists. They make for such easy commentary breaks. All right? Let's see. Yes, they make for great comedy. M, if you want to say I am not a virgin, you will have to produce physical evidence. I'm just going to leave that there. Moving on, a glaring lack of confirmation. Page 387. Ronan suggests that Brooke Neville's accusations against me are valid because he writes, quote, Neville's told, quote, I guess, like a million people, except he uses slave quotes and not like quote quotes, about Lauer. She told her inner circle of friends. She told colleagues and superiors at NBC. She was never inconsistent, and she made the seriousness of what happened clear. Moving on back to Matt. Does Ronan offer any proof of this claim? Does he say he confirmed this story with any of the friends or colleagues she claims to have told about the seriousness of what she now alleges happened in Sochi? Does he include a single comment or quote from a corroborating source for these claims? No, he does not. He writes, quote, when Brooke moved to a new job within the company, working as a producer for Peacock Productions, she reported it to one of her new bosses there. She felt they should know in case it became public and she became a liability, unquote. Does he write that he tried to track down that superior at Peacock Productions? Parenthetical, which, it should be noted, is completely separate from the Today Show, parenthetical. Did he include a quote, and by the way, the parenthetical outside the sentence. I know people have said that that's legit. It still looks wonky to me. Did he include a quote or a comment from that superior? Did he find out if that superior had, in fact, been told about the seriousness of what Brooke now claims? No, he did not. How do I know that? Because I did. Emphasis, Matt Lauer's. It took me 15 minutes to find out who that new boss was. I then contacted Sharon Scott, who ran Peacock Productions at the time Brooke was hired there. Sharon, concerned that she might not have been made aware of a serious situation involving a member of her staff, contacted Brooke's direct superior. They spoke at length. That new boss told Sharon Scott that one night, Brooke simply started talking about having an affair with me. She said, most importantly, that Brooke never said a single word about this being anything but a consensual affair. She said Brooke in no way conveyed, quote, the seriousness of, unquote, of what she now claims. There was never a mention of assault or rape. She says she considered Brooke a friend, and Brooke told her the story the way someone would gossip with a friend. She told Sharon Scott that there was nothing in what Brooke told her that made her feel it was necessary to contact anyone in management about any concerns. This superior also stated that Ronan Farrow never reached out to her to confirm the story that referenced her in the book. Okay. Aha. Moving on. Page 387. What was the page before? We're still on page 387. Okay. Ronan writes about a claim Brooke made. What, on a single page this all appeared? So he's sort of like staccato, one after the other, just drop these little tidbits on one page. Okay. Ronan writes about a claim Brooke makes involving an alleged encounter in my dressing room, which was a floor above the Today Show studio. She says she came to my dressing room to get some photos, and as she leaned over my desk, she alleges I sexually assaulted her with my hands. He then writes, quote, crying, she ran to the new guy she'd started seeing, a producer who was working in the control room that morning, and told him what had happened, unquote. This story, as told in the book, is graphic, disturbing, and false. It's also another example of Ronan failing to confirm a critical claim. Did he write that he reached out to that, quote, new guy she'd started seeing, unquote, to make sure the story was accurate? Did he ask that, quote, new guy, unquote, to share what he heard from Brooke when she allegedly came crying to him in the control room that morning? He did not. How do I know that? Because I did. I called that, quote, new guy, unquote, myself, and we spoke by phone for the better part of 2 hours. He was very upset at being referenced, even indirectly, in the book, but he was worried that he would face criticism if he spoke out. But he told me that Brooke did not come crying to see him in the control room to discuss any story of did not come crying to see him in the control room to discuss any story of an assault involving me. It didn't happen. In fact, that, quote, new guy, unquote, in Brooke's life told me that he wouldn't have even been in the control room at that time of day. Ronan writes she ran crying to see him. Okay. The control room incident simply never happened because the episode, as Ronan describes it in the book, never did. That new guy also told me, as I expected, that Ronan Farrow never reached out to him to fact-check the story that referenced him in the book. Why would any journalist print an allegation of assault without ever contacting the only person who could independently verify or deny an important part of that story? In the New York Times, Ronan's fact-checker Sean Lavery admitted to Ben Smith, on the record, they never reached out to that new guy to fact-check this story in the book. Wow. And again, I take that as true because Mediaite says, and I don't think they'd say it unless they meant it, especially given the circumstances, that they verified all the claims in this story. So there you go. I mean, this is pretty damning stuff, honestly. This takes away so much credibility. I mean, you might as well be Stephen Glass. If you guys don't know who Stephen Glass was, he was a writer at the New Republic several years ago. There's a great little movie starring Anakin Skywalker himself, Hayden Christensen, as Stephen Glass. It's actually a pretty good movie. I mean, it's not an action movie or anything, but it's really interesting to see how a journalistic scandal works in some way. And if you get it on DVD, which I have a copy, there's a nice little documentary by 60 Minutes at the end that talks a lot about the real story behind it. And the movie is pretty accurate to events. And the performances are really good. Lots of good actors in there. But yeah. Okay, pages 386 and 387. Even though we were just on 387. Wow. Ronan references another ex-boyfriend of Brooks who worked for NBC. He writes that my position of authority over that boyfriend made Brooke feel she couldn't say no to our affair. Parenthetical, for the record, I had absolutely no authority over that boyfriend. And Matt, you need to put a period outside the parenthetical, because that's the end of the sentence. He also writes that Brooke's anguish and shame over our sexual encounters, quote, eventually prompted her to break up with her boyfriend, unquote. But he never writes that he spoke to that boyfriend to hear his thoughts on those subjects or on Brooke in general. This is the person Brooke lived with at the time of the Sochi Olympics, and yet Ronan never spoke to him. But I did. I spoke to that ex-boyfriend on several occasions for more than 3 hours. He knows Brooke intimately and has for many years. He was very reluctant to get involved in this story. Our conversations were difficult, but what he shared with me was illuminating. If Ronan Farrow had been engaged in a real search for the truth, he would have made sure he had the same conversation with the ex-boyfriend I did. Perhaps he didn't want anything to get in the way of his preferred narrative. That same ex-boyfriend went out of his way to express his concern for Brooke and how she might react to having her allegations challenged. He also confirmed that he felt I had no authority over him whatsoever at NBC. The ex-boyfriend made it clear, as I expected, that Ronan Farrow never spoke to him to fact-check anything having to do with the references to him in the book or anything else. Page 386. One of the biggest challenges for Ronan was to find explanations for Brooke's behavior toward me after what she now claims was an assault in Sochi. Brooke readily admitted to Ronan that she helped arrange and participated in future sexual encounters between us in my apartment over the course of a 4-month relationship. She also told friends she was having an affair with me without ever mentioning it was anything but consensual. And finally, she admitted to Ronan and NBC that she reached out to me after the affair had ended, trying to see me again. These are significant issues, but Ronan deals with them in only a few brief yet illuminating sentences. Quote, she attempted to convey that she was comfortable and even enthusiastic about the encounters. She even tried to convince herself of the same, unquote. Quote, she readily admitted that her communications with Lauer might have appeared friendly and obliging, unquote. But after writing those things, he proceeds to give Brooke the benefit of every single doubt and finds explanations for all of her actions while offering me nothing close to the presumption of innocence. He concludes that Brooke was still in shock over what allegedly happened in Sochi, and she hadn't yet come to the conclusion it was an assault, even over 3 years later when, in a room with her own lawyer and 2 female representatives of NBC, she lodged her complaint without ever mentioning the words assault or rape. From start to finish, Ronan is acting as Brooke's advocate, not as a journalist investigating her claims. He is breaking a cardinal rule of journalism. He has come to a self-serving conclusion first, and then he sees everything through the prism of that assumption. There isn't a single quote in the book from anyone who claims that Brooke told them this affair was anything other than consensual. Not one. And again, I would be saying, take this with a grain of salt, because this is Matt Lauer talking, and obviously he's not an uninvolved party in this, but extending the benefit of the doubt to Mediaite's contention that they double-checked everything that Lauer puts in here, as far as rechecking with witnesses, let's say. That's pretty damning. Back to chat for a second. John Miller, Stephen Glass, any relation to George Glass? I don't know who George Glass is, so I couldn't tell you. Humble Clay, no, the period goes inside the quotes, even though the parenthetical is ending the sentence, because there wasn't a period at the end of the sentence. The parenthetical, came after. I don't know. Let's see. Humble Clay, the period always goes inside the quotation marks. Yes, I understand that, but I'm talking about a parenthetical that was capping off the end of a sentence previous to the beginning of the parenthetical. So shouldn't the period come after the parenthetical? I don't Let's see. And the dead Kaiser, hello. Quote, 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 off quote, quote. Yeah, well, I'm trying to be accurate. I don't quote, end quote all the time, but I try to do my best. Because in case somebody's listening to this without actually watching this or reading the actual story, it should be clear what is a quote and what is the commentary from the author. Moving on, contradictions left unchallenged, page 381. After Brooke filed her complaint against me, resulting in my firing, Ronan writes she was worried she'd be identified. Quote, I just live in terror, unquote, she told Farrow. But Ronan never challenges that assertion, notwithstanding what he wrote on page 387, where he directly quotes Brooke as saying she, quote, told like a million people about Lauer. She told her inner circle of friends. She told colleagues and superiors at NBC, unquote. Most journalists would have asked Brooke to explain how she could have been terrified she would be identified when, by her own claim, she made little effort to keep her identity secret. Most journalists would have questioned Brooke about the fact that, according to her own words, there would have been, quote, like a million people, unquote, who could possibly identify her. Did Ronan challenge her on that claim as a journalist? Did Ronan quote even one of those million people in his book? He did not. While he was writing about Brooke being terrified of losing her anonymity, did he remind the reader that a year after filing her complaint against me with NBC, Brooke was pitching a book of her own? In fact, Brooke told a close friend, with whom I spoke, that she, quote, needed Ronan to out her, unquote, in his book so she would be able to write a book without being criticized for it. Did Ronan attempt to be transparent about this? He did not. Page 386. Ronan writes about what Brooke claims were her emotions during our affair. Quote, Neville's told friends at the time that she felt trapped, unquote. Did Ronan speak with those friends? Does he verify this claim? Does he quote even a single friend of Brooke's who confirmed she told them she felt trapped in the affair? He does not. Next section, no proof, no problem, page 374. Ronan splashes the content of messages I sent to a former NBC employee named Addie Collins in 2000 across this page in bold capital letters. Quote, now you're killing me. You look great today, exclamation point, unquote. He wants the reader to see, in dramatic fashion, what I wrote to her in the midst of what she admits was a consensual relationship 20 years ago. I can confirm these are actual messages I wrote and sent. It's embarrassing, but true. I mean, if you were in a consensual relationship and you're complimenting her, maybe I'm missing some context there. It doesn't seem embarrassing, but whatever. After seeing how eager Ronan was to share the enlarged text of my messages to Addie Collins, the reader might be asking, where are the text messages and emails Ronan claims I sent to Brooke Neville's in Sochi? After all, if messages from a 2 decades old consensual affair are important, messages that led to an allegation of rape in 2014 would have to be crucial. Why aren't those messages in capital letters on the pages of this book? While on page 384, Ronan goes out of his way to describe texts and emails he claims Brooke and I exchanged on the night she came to my hotel room in Russia, he offers zero proof that those texts or emails ever existed or that they existed in the form or sequence he describes. Isn't it fair to assume that he would have, at the very least, written that he personally viewed those messages? Isn't it fair to assume that if Ronan had seen them, he would have splashed them across the pages of this book the way he did my messages to Addie Collins? Does Ronan write that he saw those messages? He does not. Does Ronan quote anyone else who says they saw them? He does not. My clear recollection is inconsistent with the course of communications as laid out in Ronan's book. Is it possible a complete examination of communications between Brooke and me that night might reveal a different set of facts? Well, I guess he'll tell us in a second. Oh, Pepperjack, you my only friend. Assassin of the Gray, Scribelight, I linked the show across the Discords. Please continue quoting the quotes. You must quote for an accurate quote about the quote. Yes. And here we go. Playing word games, page 375. Ronan writes, quote, over the course of 2018, I'd learn of 7 claims of sexual misconduct raised by women who worked with Lauer, unquote. Back to Matt. This is Ronan at his most manipulative. It is imperative to note that although Ronan truly wants the reader to conclude he is saying there were, quote, 7 claims of sexual misconduct, unquote, against me, he is not. In fact, he has been forced to admit that on other occasions, including in a live television interview on ABC. He is referring to some allegations that have absolutely nothing to do with me. He intentionally writes there were, quote, 7 claims of sexual misconduct raised by women who worked with Lauer, unquote, not by women against Lauer, in an attempt to manipulate readers into believing there were 7 allegations relating to me. There were not. That is very clever word choice, isn't it? In addition, when he writes, quote, I'd learn of 7 claims, unquote, he intentionally doesn't say he spoke to those women. Is he relying on hearsay? Is he referring to secondhand or third-hand accounts of these claims? Is he relying on gossip? He never says. He continues, quote, most of the women could point to documents or other people they told to back up their accounts, unquote. Does Ronan provide a quote from any such document? He does not. Page 380. Ronan writes about a, quote, senior member of the Today Show team, unquote, who left the network in 2017 after receiving, quote, a 7-figure payout in exchange for signing a non-disclosure agreement, unquote. He writes, quote, she'd raised harassment and discrimination concerns, though the network said the payout was unrelated to any specific complaint, unquote. Ronan simply refuses to believe the network's statement that there was no specific complaint leveled as part of that person's exit package. Certainly not against me. He uses insinuation to look for cover-ups and conspiracies around every corner. As Ben Smith wrote in the New York Times, conspiracy is, quote, the other big theme that shapes his work. His stories are built and sold on his belief, which he rarely proves, that powerful forces and people are conspiring against those trying to do good, especially Mr. Farrow himself, unquote. For example, the pepper jack is getting to me. So, in for a penny, in for a pound. For example, Farrow writes this senior member of the Today Show, quote, also mentioned Lauer and sexual harassment to one senior vice president, though she didn't share with NBC the material I later reviewed that showed Lauer had left voicemails and sent texts that she saw as passes at her, unquote. If her payout had anything at all to do with me, why wouldn't she have shared with NBC the very same material Ronan claims she shared with him? If she were claiming any kind of harassment on my part, wouldn't voicemails and texts have represented crucial proof to be revealed to the network? Did Ronan ask her those questions? If he did, he offers no explanation. He simply lets his insinuation stand. Ronan carefully writes that he reviewed that. Let me try that again. Ronan carefully writes that he reviewed that material, quote, she saw as passes at her, unquote. If he reviewed the material, why can't he say he also felt they were passes at her? Is it possible those voicemails and texts were never shared with the network because they didn't reveal harassment and because the circumstances of that employee leaving the network had nothing to do with any complaint against me? Page 75. Ronan repeats a story that first surfaced shortly after I was fired by NBC. Ronan writes that an unnamed female colleague had sex with me in my office after I pressed a button that remotely shut the door. In parenthetical, at least he stayed away from the myth that I had a button that could lock someone in my office, a fact that NBC has publicly debunked. End parenthetical. He simply regurgitates this story that was printed in another publication in 2017, also with poor fact-checking, and he does nothing to verify it. He writes that during the sexual encounter, quote, she passed out, Lauer's assistant took her to a nurse, unquote. But at no time during his reporting did Ronan ever reach out to my assistant to ask her about this sensational story or anything else he alleges in this book. Ronan had nearly 2 years to fact-check this outrageous claim with the most obvious source, but he did not. This is a woman of honesty and integrity who has been a valued employee at NBC for almost 25 years. How can he write, quote, Lauer's assistant took her to a nurse, unquote, without even making the effort to ask my assistant if the story was true? Does he provide any evidence that anyone else witnessed my assistant accompany someone to the nurse who had passed out in my office? No, he does not. Had he called my assistant, she would have told him that she never took anyone to the nurse who had any kind of medical issue while in my office, ever. Okay. Conflicted sources, page 377. Ronan often builds stories on a foundation of allegations made by deeply conflicted sources, but he keeps those conflicts largely hidden by withholding information from the reader. There is no better example of this than Melissa Lauer. For nearly 10 years, Lauer has spread a false rumor alleging I exposed myself to her in my office. Absolutely nothing in our professional, platonic relationship leading up to or following this alleged encounter supports her claim. Nothing. Lauer oversaw celebrity bookings at Today for several years, but was fired from NBC in 2013. She did not leave the network on good terms. After Lauer was fired, her job was given to someone close to me. It infuriated her. Lauer is also a close friend of Ann Curry, and both believed I had a major role in having Ann removed from our show in 2012 in what was a terrible chapter at Today that played out in the headlines. They both blame me, and they did little to hide their feelings with people, both inside and outside the network. Lauer is a textbook disgruntled source with a grudge against NBC and me. Does Ronan give this information the attention it deserves? Does he put her story in context? He does not. In Ronan's first description, Lauer is simply, quote, the Today Show producer who met with me, Farrow, after she left to work in radio, unquote. Only later in the book does he write that she was fired by the network. And then, in explaining her dismissal, he manages to craft another elaborate and false conspiracy involving me. In the book, Ronan uses Ann Curry, whose personal and professional animosity towards me is well documented, as the person Lauer told about the alleged exposing encounter, and tells Ronan on page 378, boy, 378 and 387 must be like the magic pages in this book, and tells Ronan on page 378 that she approached two senior executives at NBC about a problem with me, but admits she never told anyone at the network about any specific incident or accuser. Ronan never names either of those senior executives at NBC, nor does Ronan offer confirmation or quotes from either. Conclusion. In an effort to promote one of his Catch and Kill podcasts several months ago, Ronan tweeted the following, quote, none of my reporting would be possible without fact-checking, unquote. After investigating Ronan's journalistic efforts myself and reading the recent reporting on him in the New York Times, I think that statement falls quite flat. The examples of shoddy journalism I've explored here are the tip of the iceberg. They are only some of the many instances I could have cited from the 2 chapters of this book about me. Maybe others will now begin to ask more questions about the 57 chapters in the book I haven't touched on here. Will anyone hold Ronan Farrow thoroughly accountable? I doubt it. After all, the book tour is over. By marketing standards, it was a smashing success. As a search for the truth, at least with regard to my story, it was not. The questions I've posed here are both professional and deeply personal. I ask people to consider how they would react if someone they love were accused of something horrific and basic journalistic standards were ignored because of a desire to sell books. I also urge people to remember that there are 2 sides to all stories. How will Ronan Farrow respond to this criticism? I doubt he'll take it lightly, and he shouldn't. He may try to change the subject by leveling new claims against me. He may question my credibility, but I have raised issues here that others could have easily raised as well. He may try to enlist allies in an effort to attack me and correct his journalistic lapses months after the damage has been done. Perhaps his publisher will also rush to his defense. Or maybe he'll surprise me. Maybe he'll simply stand up and say, I let a desire to sell books overwhelm my responsibility as a journalist. I should have done more to fact-check these stories because errors like these come with a cost. We'll see. In the meantime, I will continue to ask questions and seek answers because, ironically, I can thank Ronan for at least one thing. He has reminded me how it feels to do the work I love. So, there you go. Well, now that was embarrassing. I closed a tab and the whole thing closed down. So I took myself out of the show there for a second. Sorry about that. Yeah, live TV, everybody. So there you go. That was Matt Lauer commenting on a story about him, ostensibly, and also about journalism at large, let's say. And what he points out, I mean, is very sort of confined to that book. It's sort of easy to sort of pick apart that very specific instance. And of course, Matt Lauer is in a very special position to have some idea of the accuracy of the allegations put against him. But it's not so much the crime as it is the cover-up in these things. So, for example, as we've seen with the Joe Biden allegations of the last couple of months with Tara Reade, and how the media writ large basically has given Biden a pass. They haven't done nearly the amount of attention or excoriation of Biden as they have with Brett Kavanaugh, where Brett Kavanaugh was immediately guilty because of the allegation. Now, I need to clarify, I'm not saying they should say that Biden is guilty. They shouldn't give Biden the same treatment as Brett Kavanaugh. Okay? Innocent until proven guilty may be a legal mechanism, but it should also be a value held by people. Thou shalt not bear false witness. You know, it might be tied to a religion, but it's also something that kind of rings true amongst human beings in general. You know, don't accuse someone of something that's not true, and don't hold someone to account for something that hasn't been proven. I've talked about this before. I've been a victim of that to a very serious degree in my life, and it was not fun. I would not wish that upon my worst enemy, because I want to see my worst enemies held to account for the shit that they do, not made up stuff. That's why, you know, conjuring quotes out of thin air about Trump or Biden or Brett Kavanaugh tick me off. Don't make stuff up. Go to the actual facts. So whatever misconduct Matt Lauer may have committed in this instance, and as thorough as you can go, both Matt Lauer and Mediaite pretty much undercut everything Ronan Farrow had to say about Matt Lauer in the broad strokes. And what did I mean by the cover-up is worse than the crime? Well, if everybody who was immediately on board with indicting Kavanaugh in the press now has to face that same scenario on the opposite side of the aisle with Biden, you see where the hypocrisy lies. So now that Matt Lauer, the target of this book to some extent, has gone to the mat, no pun intended, to vet the information and allegations made by Ronan Farrow in that book that came out, 2 years ago? And no one else of any note has done that in the time since? Well, what does that say about the people who are now going to have to face the accusation that they just took it at face value, especially those that claim to be journalists? What are they going to say now? How are they going to respond? Now, there's been a couple of stories printed about this article in the last day or so, and I might bring up one or two of those tonight on Lords of the Night to see what other outlets are saying about it. But it does bring up an interesting question. Does the truth matter anymore? Now, I know you could say, oh, well, when has that ever mattered, right? When it comes to the media and the press. Well, maybe it's just me. And maybe this is a reflex of the inundation of such things that we get from social media, minute after minute, hour after hour. But does truth really matter as much as it used to anymore? Does the headline mean more than the content? I'm not innocent of having reacted to or retweeting something on reflex simply based on a salacious headline. And then only later taken the time, if I was able to, absent a paywall, to actually read the content and see, oh, yeah. Like, for example, the story just yesterday. China reports that facial recognition technology solved a missing child case from 32 years ago, where a child had been stolen from his parents, and facial recognition technology reunited them. It's like, wow, you just take that headline as it is. Thankfully, it was a headline at CNN, which thankfully doesn't charge me to look at their stuff. And if you read further in, they have to admit about 3 paragraphs afterwards that the people involved didn't describe exactly how facial recognition technology solved the case. They just say that it did. So it's a trust me story from China, which is always a sketchy bet to begin with. But yeah, this is interesting. Now, of course, you can give Matt Lauer whatever credibility you think he deserves. I don't know. I don't know the guy. Didn't watch the guy much. I knew who he was, but I've got no stake in his career or his celebrity. Ronan Farrow, I only know the name. I don't know that I've ever heard the guy actually talk. But how is the media going to react to this? What are they going to do after being called out for not doing their jobs when giant, horrible claims are made against public figures? And then they promote these things as though they were fact. I'll be curious to see. But just as I'm about to wrap this up with a couple minutes left, I'll give the last couple minutes to you guys. Assassin of the Gray, the truth does not matter to Pravda unless it directly serves their agenda. Serves their agenda, gets the most clicks, seems to attack someone in power, and so on. I mean, a story about someone who just makes everything up in a book that's meant to take down a bunch of powerful people, you'd think that'd be salacious enough. You look at, what was it, James Frey's book, The A Million Little Pieces, and how it came out that that was a whole bunch of made-up stuff. It was supposed to be an autobiography, and Oprah promoted the book, and then he had to admit, yeah, I made it all up. That's a scandal in and of itself. You get a lot of clicks for that, too. What do I know? Michael Hatfield, great stream, Scribelight. Thank you, Matt. Matt? I got Matt Lauer on the brain. Michael, thank you. Texas Red, truth over facts. Yeah. I mean, or at least corroboration, at least vetting your sources, at least quoting someone. Let's see. Texas Red also says the MSM will simply ignore it like they do the truth on a daily basis. Well, we'll see. I mean, like I said, I'm going to look for a couple of reaction stories tonight for tonight's show and see what the effect has been. Check your logic. Scribe is a very principled human being. Well, you have to take my word for it, unfortunately. I can't corroborate it, but I try to stick to him. You know, I mean, Joe Biden deserves the same treatment that Brett Kavanaugh should have gotten. Donald Trump deserves the same kind of treatment that Joe Biden is getting to a certain extent. Not a complete pass, but caution, interrogation, skepticism. You know, in the absence of physical evidence, in the absence of corroboration, an allegation is just that, an allegation. Even when it comes to something as serious as rape. You know, I mean, that's one of the paradoxes of the whole situation that a lot of this is based on. If someone comes to you, and I've had people in my real life who have been the victims of sexual abuse. And either I've heard about it in distant past anecdote or in a relatively recent occurrence. And when someone comes to you who has been hurt, who has been taken advantage of, I mean, I hope I don't have to describe to anybody here what that's like. And I hope you never experience it, either as a witness to it or, God forbid, someone who is subject to it. But it hits something in compassionate people immediately, reflexively, to protect, you know, right? Someone vulnerable, being taken advantage of, especially in a way that is in the most intimate of acts or intimate of places. The problem is, when it comes to things like this, especially as an observer from the outside, not directly involved, because I can't blame family members or friends, etc. But if you're just an observer, you have to take a step back and be pragmatic before you start retweeting or rebroadcasting stuff and ask the question, what are the facts? Is there corroboration? And if there isn't, that doesn't mean that saying I'm doubtful makes you inhuman. It just makes you skeptical. You know, case in point, the whole Jussie Smollett thing. For those of you that were watching the night that it broke on Lords of the Night, or at least when we broke it for ourselves, we read the story and we were immediately skeptical because it didn't sound right. And if my memory doesn't fail me, you'll hear that, you know, we still sided on the, or erred on the side of caution and saying, you know, I mean, it could be true. It just sounds a little goofy. Because you know, you hear something, it doesn't sound quite right, especially when something breaks. You don't necessarily have all the facts. You don't necessarily have all the context. Something else could come out the next day. So you got to be cautious, especially when it comes to somebody's reputation, especially when it comes to somebody's life or livelihood. You know, that's just my opinion. Now, am I a saint on this? Have I never reacted immediately to a declaration by the press about someone's guilt or innocence on something? No, I'm not perfect, but I hope to become a more perfect person as time goes on. And I tell you what, reading the news every night, having to assess where it's coming from, getting conflicting opinions, or maybe not conflicting opinions, but contrary opinions from my co-hosts, I hope it makes me a better person insofar as assessing these things for myself, even and especially those things I'm not even involved in. Right? It's difficult to assess things objectively when you're directly involved in them. But anyway, a couple more things from chat, and then I will close this up. Let's see. Roasted opinions. Lauer versus Farrow is the pot and the kettle. Neither is a good journalist. I can't judge Matt Lauer's totality of his career. This isolated instance, as re-verified by the publication that posted it, I take it on its own merits. And on its own merits, it does bring up some very, very, very serious questions about the credibility of Ronan Farrow and his journalism, not only on Matt Lauer, but then, by extension, anyone or anything else he's ever reported on. So now hopefully will be a mission on some people's parts to really go over what he said in his publications in the past and check. This is what happened to Stephen Glass. This is what should happen to Ronan Farrow at this point. And let's see. Dark Alile, a little goofy. Isn't that Max? Goof troop. And lastly, Veror of Ashmedai. Scribe says he's honest, but have you ever actually seen his pepper jack? Well, I did post a picture of 3 items on my, at least on my stovetop a while back, and it was a bottle of Jack Daniels, a bag of goldfish, and I believe a 6-pack of Dr. Pepper, or at least a Dr. Pepper. So yeah, I do it. I don't know how else to tell you. I could take a picture, I suppose, and show you. But you'll just have to trust me. Everyone, thank you so much for coming out and listening to this. I hope it was interesting, informative, enlightening. I don't know. That's up to you. I will return in the next day or two with another TED Excellence episode because I got a couple raring to go. Also, be sure to look for me, Ranting Monkey, and Satsu 2 Cents tonight on Ranting Monkey's channel at 6 p.m. Pacific, 9 p.m. Eastern for Lords of the Night, where we'll go over the news and tidbits and probably terrible things that our audience will send us in news stories and blogs. Because that's just how we roll. Hope you all are safe and well. If you're not well, please get well soon. Thank you for your generosity. Thank you for your attendance. Thank you for your participation. And I will talk to you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.